My name is Francesco Marullo. I come from Italy, from a city very close to Rome, the south side. I've studied architecture in Rome. I did my bachelor there. I'm part of a generation that, let's say, was hit by the Bologna reform. So we were basically the first generation that entirely, was somehow victim of the Bologna reform. So but at the same time, we attempted to get all the possibilities that the Bologna reform opened to the students. So basically what happened is that, architecture in Italy has always been a 5-year program, usually. Instead, our program was the first one to do the 3 + 2 years. So basically 3 years bachelor, 3 years of graduate studies. And what happened is that as soon as I finished my studies as a bachelor, I began looking around and see if I could, further develop my research abroad, since at that time was possible. And it's nice because, architecture schools in Rome, there are only, let's say, 2 architecture schools in Rome. The historical one, the La Sapienza, famous for the 1968 riots, and then a very young, somewhat revolutionary school, which is called Roma 3. Very selective. Usually there were only 200 places a year, if I remember correctly. So you had to do an exam in order to get accepted and get in, because it was at that time still very very competitive and small, and with very young professors at the time. And but at the same time, so they offered this 3 years program, and we were the first to finish this. And so some other school was yet unprepared to for offering a let's say very consolidated graduate program, and that's why me and only 2 colleagues, we were the first 3 to just leave the school and attempt this next step of the 2 graduate 2 years abroad. And so originally I wanted to study with CISA in Porto. That was my dream, but Lisbon and Portugal were not part yet of the Bologna process network. And so they accepted me, obviously, to go there, but I had to, according to them, I had to repeat some exams because, of course, the curricula couldn't really be compared. And that's why, for a strange series of coincidences, I end up in Delft, at the TU Delft Polytechnic, which is also my second choice, with these other 2 friends, very close friends of mine, which was very good. It was a particular coincidence because in the graduate master's, class in Delft was run by Umberto Barbieri. At the time, it was very close to Mario Manieri Elia. Mario Manieri Elia is a very famous, passed away some years ago, but a very famous collaborator of Manfredo da Furi. He was teaching at UAV and many important places in Italy, and was somehow the most important professor at Roma 3. He was teaching history and theory at Roma 3. So actually I began, my first class in architecture was with Manieri Elia, which was almost a dream. And so the introduction to architecture, I still remember, first day, first class, first year was introduction to architecture by Manieri Elia. And you were listening 3 hours in a row with no breaks, this guy talking. And it was simply, outstanding just to hear that. And now, I don't know, I feel that those things, not sure if they're still happening somewhere. But anyway, so we were so honored to have a letter of recommendation by Manieri Elia for TU Delft. And as soon as Umberto Barbieri got these 3 students from Rome recommended by Manieri Elia, we basically just got in to this school. And so from a tiny school of a couple of hundred students, we arrived to Delft, which was a machine producing 3,000 architects a year, like 3,000, let's say, students a year. And that was a kind of a shock, obviously. I was passing from a school that was, working at a very slow pace, on obviously entirely focused on historical background and like architectural intervention with a very conscious and a dedicated and meticulous relationship with the past, to a school instead where everything was fast, everything was about the future, everything was about technology. So I had to suddenly, from my very rudimental knowledge of AutoCAD, I had to learn Maya, Rhino, all Illustrator, Photoshop, collage. Everything arrived at speed, an incredible speed, which was fantastic. It was an incredible adventure, which lasted 2 years. I had to say, Netherlands was great, like Delft was great, like the community to be there, the incredible exposure to architects. Rotterdam and Delft were very close, and Rotterdam was still one of the most important cities for architecture in the world. Like a lot of firms are based in there. And so, we've been very lucky to be exposed to TU Delft knowledge and professors, but also lectures of institutions which were very close, among them obviously the Berlage Institute, which was at that time still in Rotterdam. So I remember every Saturday or Friday we were traveling there, taking the train. It was like 15 minutes just to listen to classes and seminars and conversations which were open to the wide public. So yes, Netherlands was really, really an incredible experience, super rich. And then, while studying in Delft, already when I was a student, I began also working at school. I became immediately student assistant, and so I was helping some, people in their classes, just very, simple things. But it was at that time, already during my, my graduate studies, that I was teaching there for a seminar, Pier Vittorio Aureli. It was a very, almost another very interesting, shocking moment, because I found somehow in Pier Vittorio, all the interests that I had, I found a lot of affinities in what was interesting me at that time, yet were still, of course, not entirely mature. So it was somehow, it was just passing. He was just teaching there for a seminar, and I was lucky enough to just be there when he was there. But yeah, I kept following on my own path, and so I graduated there. My graduation was particularly odd in the school. I remember because it was entirely, after 2 years of a lot of technologies, I proposed my mentor that at the time my thesis. I'm saying many things at the same time. But the TU Delft works still with thesis. So you end up your graduate studies with a thesis. So you have to, assess your own, propose your own argument, and propose your own project. And that year we were meant to go to Sarajevo. I was part of this department, which is called Border Condition, which was attempted to somehow relate architecture with some political, with some political issues and, like geopolitical, let's say, themes. But at the time to go, a few months before leaving to Sarajevo, the military situation got worse. And so the studio was canceled. And so we had to, we had been invited to apply to another studio still within the same department. And so we did our final thesis in Benidorm in Spain, which is this pop-up tourist city, very particular urban phenomenon, very close to Valencia. Yes, and my tutor, my mentor, Marc Skonderbeck and Olga Vasquez Ruano, were my two professors there at the time following my thesis. Somehow they also encouraged me to follow up my, nostalgic approach, because Benidorm is a city of tourism, but a very particular kind of tourism. We were looking at people that were, they were spending their last, last moments of their life before passing away. Maybe were, terminal, people with terminal diseases or, extremely sick. And so I don't know. Paradoxically, my thesis on Benidorm was about death. It was not about fun and tourism and these middle class UK tourists or German tourists going there, just for a couple of days and getting drunk. But it was more about, how the city was transformed, and also the landscape was somehow eroded by this incredible fast, fast-paced urbanism. Benidorm is famous because of its, high rises, hotels, and the high consumption of water and resources that completely dry out the region. And so now Benidorm is forced to pump water, from the inland in Spain. So somehow, these, phenomena created a problem in the region itself. And so rather than focusing on the shore and the beach and, this, again, sort of a fast consumption of touristic city, I focused on the inland where, my project was for a cemetery and a crematorium in Benidorm. And so I decided to draw all the project by hand and doing particular models that could actually decay through time, so were clay models but not cooked, so models were crumbling along the way. And somehow this project generated a lot of interest in the school, because the department itself was particular in the school. The department allowed the students, so I was lucky enough to end up in that department, allowed their students to be very free, especially in the final presentation. You have to know that in Delft there are the final review is particular. You have a first part of your exam that is purely technical, so it's called the go-no-go. And so if you pass that exam, you are technically already an architect, although with a minimum grade, you with a 6, but still you demonstrated that your project is thoroughly analyzed and developed. So it's just the black and white drawings, and of course mine were all done mostly by hand. And then after that, then you can dedicate yourself, with the final presentation, the models, the color panels, all the drawings that you want. And so, within this department, what our tutors wanted us to push us was to also create our own exhibition, if you want. And so I did my final project in the technical room underground in the building. So basically in an illegal space, which was not meant to be somehow used by students. So only, let's say, the janitors or the technical, let's say, team of the school could go there, because there are all the heating system. And so, that exhibition was kind of particular because, I rebuilt almost some parts of the building, not one-to-one obviously, but let's say at a very large scale anyway, was very interesting. And somehow, because of that, I managed to get into the Archivo, with an awarded thesis. But, why I'm mentioning all this? Well, because at my go-no-go and during this final presentation, a woman was sitting in the jury. Her name was Cynthia Ochen. Cynthia was working for OMA at that time. She was actually the PR of OMA. She particularly criticized my hand drawings, yet she loved them. But of course, she was not really in love with particular, let's say, rendition of the drawings themselves. But as soon as I finished my exam, she asked me to join OMA. She just told me, "What do you have to do this summer after this?" And she told me, "Yeah, come next week for an interview, because I think you fit in the." And obviously, as you can imagine, as just super young student, not even conscious of what I was doing. To have such an offer was almost like an incredible privilege. So basically, I didn't even have time to party enough. I know we party a lot because that year, which was 2006, Italy won the World Cup right after my final review. And so there was just this gigantic party, and then I began working at OMA just 2 weeks afterwards. And so it was pretty intense. It was great. It was fantastic. And so as soon as I finished school, I I went straight to an office, which was really interesting. And of course, I love OMA, and I mean, it was almost one of my dreams at the time to work in that environment. Super hectic, super frantic. The beauty of OMA has always been the people working there and the teams and the incredible environment that you have around you. Of course, when you're a student, everything is mesmerizing. The rhythms were super intense, but at the same time I was so in love and so convinced of everything was happening there that I almost enjoyed to be there when everybody was not supposed to be there. Working during the weekend, having lunch and dinners there. Somehow it was a very good. It was a very good experience because I was also lucky enough to end up in a very good team. So again, it was almost like to be in a family, sort of a family. And I also learned, but at the same time was very tough. I had to say, I collaborated with people and was not always happy to have, sometimes with some project leader I didn't have a very good relationship. It was very hard for a very young trainee at that time, intern, to have their own words on discussions. Of course, it depended from the teams, but I remember the very beginning was a mixture of incredible enthusiasm and at the same time a lot of also frustration because I'm not having the capacity to somehow have my real contribution to the projects. But then this developed very soon because, as I said, I was lucky enough to end up in a fantastic team, and from there also have the possibility also to have meetings with RAM, working with EMO. Working with Prada, and that was really satisfying. I remember one of my last project leader was Alexander Reichert. He was the guy at the time that was somehow arranging all the exhibition of OMA for Prada, so all the fashion shows, but also the website. There was really almost the beginning of the collaboration between OMA and Prada. And at that time I found super interesting, although at the same time also super paradoxical, the fact that you can spend months on a 12 minutes catwalk still was super, let's say, rewarding to that incredible congestions of idea and brainstorming and of all sorts. But what I remember the most is really the teamwork and the fact that the conversation that you had around the table, before and after, working and during working was really satisfying. But at the same time, while working there, I also began to, the frustrated side also began to somehow develop further and increase. Of course, I was happy to be there, but at the same time, I began also way more critical in what kind of life was in the office. The rhythm of the office, the rhythms and the way people, the amount of hours and work and labor develop within the office. The fact that sometimes people were really forced to be there, even sometimes for very useless somehow tasks, and this began to really a rise and a very high criticism towards the profession itself. So I remember that with some friends there and outside the office, we began to question the necessity to have a union or to the necessity to moderate the working hours. I still even remember, I'm not sure if this can be on tape, I don't know. But there were even, at some point, that I remember I think it was a Saturday or a Sunday, that there was a moment in which all the teams stopped working. And there was, all the teams asked the partners to discuss about the issue, because the rhythms were really frantic, and sometimes, just for the sake of production sometimes, we're not really entirely, justified in terms of, results. And so, yeah, I was somehow in the middle of all this very particular, it happened very fast. I only worked there for 8 months because after the incredible experience of Prada with Alexander and Emo, Prada went on holiday. I remember it was a summer, so I was going to be moved in two other projects, and so that was not really satisfying me at all. And so I remember I went to resign, like I quit, but already with a willingness to further develop my studies. So while in OMA, I decided to basically to better investigate the labor condition and the professional condition of the architect, and also the way of working within an office. And so I remember I went back to Cynthia, basically the woman that hired me, telling her that I wanted to study more, and I still remember that one of her last comment was, "Yes, it's great that you do that, but then don't come back, because here we prefer to have people that like work and think less." That was, I still remember it was like, I don't know, it was like, anyway, I still remember that sentence. But I mean, it's not really critical to AMA, because I mean, again, I was part of a group of a very large people. I mean, all my co-workers and other students went up working in other offices, and the situation was somehow similar to many others. Of course, OMA was somehow one of the most discussed let's say office environment at the time, but it was a very common problem. And I still remember that after those years, also some publications and some also people in Rotterdam began to issue newsletters, and like sharing this newsletter or emails across all the offices, documenting the higher and the heavy labor time and shifts that were occurring in architecture offices. And this became then like a very huge theme of discussion abroad. But yes, I don't regret anything of my OMA time. I think I even suggest all of my students to have an experience in a big firm, because I think it's necessary, because you learn to cooperate, you understand how important it is to share ideas and also to defend them, and also to the fact that you will never be alone. You always need to negotiate your thoughts with somebody else. And but also the necessity to be fast and straightforward. I think one of the biggest finding and outcome of my OMA experience was the rapidity to develop drawings and things, but also the ability to put forward something, and the ability also to explain it in a convincing way. So I think that was a fantastic lesson, and something that sometimes at school is hard to to get. Instead, in the office, and with the necessity of the profession, and necessity of deadlines and constant presentation with clients, there is a certain rhythm that I think it's almost beneficial if a student could learn, possibly even at school. No, by chance OMA now runs some of these Harvard classes. I think it's interesting that the university is moving within the office, and the collaboration between universities and offices is more and more. Now, for example, TU Delft, the school where I studied, is very much in close relationship with many other firms, and there are actually people of firms that teach at universities and so forth. So this negotiation was there, still an experiment, and now is pretty much consolidated. So yeah, while I was OMA, I decided that I wanted to study more and try to understand the production environment in architecture, but still I needed a break. So right after quitting OMA, I just took my backpack and I went 3 months walking in South America, from Peru to Patagonia, which was great. I managed to see and visit a lot of Chilean friends that I met at TU Delft. At the time, there was a very huge group of Chilean students there, and so I was able to visit them and see other schools, Valparaiso, Talca, other ways of studying architecture and teaching architecture and learning architecture. And then I think during that journey, on my own and with other people, I definitely took the decision that I wanted to study more. And then after that, I went back first to Italy, to Rome, where I taught for the first time, somehow with an urban studies professor. So not immediate, let's say, not architectural focus, but more focus on the city itself and urban issues. His name, the name of the professor is Giovanni Caudo, who is actually a very now relevant professor and figure in Rome. It was it was taking care during one of the previous administration of the city of Rome, the left-wing administration. He was in charge of the urban, let's say, department at the city hall. And I mean, he has a very important role within the city and in movements, political movements about commoning and the housing question. Is basically Giovanni is one of the most important figures in understanding the issues of social housing and housing in Rome, and also Italy as well. And so in that year of teaching with him in his class, I was his assistant, but also he let me teach part of his seminars. I developed my proposal for a PhD thesis. And I was lucky enough at that time that there were two schools that I really loved to apply. One was in Switzerland at the PFL, where another of my mentors, Roberto Gargiani, now teaching at EPFL, and now actually, unfortunately, forced to retire from EPFL. So I think this year will be the last year he's teaching at EPFL. He was my history and theory professor at Roma 3 when I was doing my bachelor. I had an interview with him, and I could have developed my PhD there. And then at the same time, there was a call for application for a new PhD program at the Berlage Institute in Rotterdam, so going back to the Netherlands, which was called The City as a Project, run by Pier Vittorio Aureli. And then and suddenly, obviously, I had to make the choice between these two very different programs. One was the one at PFL was strictly about history, and so Professor Roberto, at the time Professor Gargiani, was teaching and doing research, history research in a very particular, very detached way, very close to the archives, very scientific, very traditional way of approaching historical research at that time. And then instead, Pier Vittorio at the Berlage Institute was proposing something more, if you want, more theoretical, meaning like more speculative, and also what I love, and I think that's why, somehow was really, let's say, invited me to apply there, because it was much more aiming towards the political side of research. So what, you want to study a specific thing, what are the political implications, what are, why you want to study the thing, what's your project, what's your political project. So somehow I ended up applying to the city as a project, and trying, because somehow the brief itself was really responding to all the ambition and even the almost like fulfilling all the desire that I wanted, the desire that I had for keeping on my research. And so I applied there, and Pier Vittorio loved my research proposal, which was about labor and production. So the architecture of labor and production, the relationship between, let's say, look at how architecture somehow accommodated productive activities, not only material but also immaterial. But also how struggle, so how the opposition of the workers somehow was able to, trigger a new way of working, or stimulate a new way of conceiving the space of production, the space of labor. So we're not simply studying factories or universities, even housing, but also how certain kind of opposition to those spaces, certain kind of even the dissolutions or let's say disruption of the spaces somehow even like fed or improved the pervasiveness of the systems of control systems of measures of production itself. So I moved back to the Netherlands, and I started to study the Berlage, and was truly, I think, the first, the program, the Recibidas project was meant to be a part-time PhD program, which was very appealing, because I think the project of Per Vittorio was really ambitious, because he wanted also to have, or actually was meant to be for also practitioners, so people that have an office or they have their own practice on the side of working. And that was really, I think, super interesting at that time. Another reason why I somehow I embraced that program rather than going to the PFL is precisely because of that reason. Like because at that time I thought was much more in tune with what was happening around me, and also my experience that I had in OMA was precisely that this combination of working at the same time critical looking at what you were doing, so was perfect for me, like to have that. And then so I totally I totally fell in love with the school, and then Per Vittorio was just fantastic. The seminars, I remember the lecture series and the seminar there was just fantastic. And then we're a group of very, very selected group of people. Originally at that time, the first year I think was the best, because we were still all living in Rotterdam, and so the environment was great, and they were very debated. Each of us was constantly asked to present his own work and share it with other colleagues, and so criticism was also very strong. So this pushed us to constantly revise our thesis and strengthen our thesis. So I think it was a fantastic way of working. And then many things happened. At the same time, Per Vittorio offered me to work for Dogma. I remember there was a moment in which they needed work. Him and Martino Tatra at that time Dogma was not yet known as it was known as an office, but was not properly an office. We were working at the Berlage and in Per Vittorio's living room, so that was the office, and we were basically 4 people, and that was again confirmed the idea of having a total continuity between life and work. Basically, I was studying at Berlage at the same time working with my mentor, and so was really incredibly such a rich and intense moment of my life, and I think I learned so much, and also the project I was involved in and with Dogma were also very close to my research. We were working on the university environment. We were working on a factory building. So somehow I almost felt, and my research and at the same time working for Dogma for me was also a way to test my ideas on the project itself. And also incredibly enough, I moved from a very huge firm. When I was working in OMA, we were 200 people to a 3 people firm, which was fantastic, because Per Vittorio and Martino basically let me sometimes even just basically do all the work and just test the ideas, right? Sometimes they didn't even have the time to work with me, so I had a lot of responsibility at the time, and so was actually, I have to say, great. And also their collaboration was somehow there were no hierarchies. Obviously there were Dogma is Per Vittorio and Martino, but at the same time also with my other colleague, gradually the office got more, commitments, and then they had to hire more and more people, still in a sort of domestic environment, which I think was the best moment. Now I think they're much more they're much more regular as an office. Before was really an interesting experiment of life, if you want, and I found that extremely interesting. And yes, I had to say it was great, because we were almost at the same level, and so discussing a project was really satisfying, right? Because you can really, express your ideas, but also, debate, also very, animated discussion. And so, ending up then in dinner, naturally extending to, so it was not, what everything that now is criticized, right? The merging between life and work at that time was actually the best, the most inspiring, if you want, experience that you wanted to have. I was still young, and I found, extremely, satisfying to have such moment of intense exchange. But there was also a moment in which I also, again, like in May, there was a moment of super intense devotion, and then at the same time also I began to elaborate that I needed to have a critical detachment, especially from Pier Vittorio, because Pier Vittorio was also my mentor in my thesis. So there was too much going on, and so I had to at some point I asked them if I could detach. Although I could have keep on working with them because it was really simply fantastic, and I still of course love their work. But there was also a moment in which I wanted to develop also my idea and my own approach to the things, and so again also in that case I quit, and I focused also on my research, because at that point also I had to start writing my dissertation, and I found that was a very important move, because not only at that time I also began working on my own projects, but also allowed me also to achieve certain criticism towards my research and and what I was doing at the time. And with two colleagues of mine within the city as a project ensemble, Amir Jalali and Ahmed Khosravi, we began having some strange experiments. Here I can tell you a lot of stories, but as I mentioned, the group was at the beginning. The city is a project group. Just to have you some names. So some temporal references. So I studied in Rome. I studied between 2001, 2004. I went from 2004. I went straight to Delft, and I graduated there in 2 years. So I studied in Delft between 2004 and 2006. I basically worked in OMA up 2007. I taught in Rome up 2008, and then I applied to the PhD program in 2009. So basically, it was almost like a seamless process. And then I defended my thesis in 2014. I was telling you that the program was meant originally to be part-time, but then it suddenly revealed impossible to be you really had to dedicate yourself entirely. And that was one of the reasons why I also decided to detach myself from Dogma, because at some point the commitment for the office and the commitment for the PhD was just simply unbearable. And also Pier Vittorio understood, and they needed people that were fully committed with the office, and I couldn't, of course, commit myself too much. But while at the peak, let's say, of the research process, the group first of all began to spread apart. Don't want now to tell you all the stories, but also the financial crisis hit Europe. The Berlage Rotterdam closed at some point for financial reasons, and the program was entirely moved to Delft, and so the group, the city as a project group, began to spread apart in different parts of Europe. People moved back to their own countries. People went to teach abroad, in other countries, and so the only one that somehow remained in Rotterdam were me, Amir Jalali. We were at that time was actually living in Amsterdam, and Ahmed Khosravi, and I don't know, there was a very almost like immediate sense of affinities, and like we had the same perspective on things, and so we began almost for fun to do competitions. But the funny thing is that competition, but also writing. I forgot, there was also a fourth person, Bernardina Borra in Amsterdam, with whom and Amir Jalali we wrote pieces, like for magazine. I remember at the time San Rocco was very like a renowned magazine at the time, and it was very very much spread, like diffused among architects. So I was lucky enough to write several times for San Rocco, but I remember we were writing like we were submitting pieces and our thoughts. So this was something very good of the PhD program opened by Pier Vittorio, is that he was forcing us to write a lot, like to write critical pieces. So not to rely on peer review journal, which is usually the standard the standard, let's say, routine of a PhD student, right? You had to write for a specific journal that because the peer review article then also give you credits and give you points, right? Which actually now, going backwards, would have been actually also profitable because they build up your curriculum, obviously. But instead, he encouraged us to write as much as possible and to put our writings out there and our thoughts out there. And so people writing for Log, people writing for those grassroots magazine. But those magazines were much more influential than the peer review journal, and I think it's still today like that. Log magazine is still way more relevant than other journals. So yes, and that was our ambition. But on one side we were trying to write, and on the opposite side we were trying to do competitions. But we were trying to do competition in a very odd way, under an invented name, so a fake name and a fake identity, because somehow we wanted to go against the idea of authorship, or let's say the idea of the name and the name and the authorship within the architectural competition. And we thought that by joining force and operating under a fake name that could actually host a multi-individual entity behind a single name could have been somehow interesting. And so we began operating again within the fake name of Matteo Mannini. And I don't tell you now the story of Matteo Mannini, but Matteo Mannini comes. If you read the first chapter of Manfredo da Furi, the research of Renaissance, you will find who is Matteo Mannini and the story of Matteo Mannini and Brunelleschi. But let's say it's an invented name of the past, invented by Brunelleschi, but at the same time, was also an invented entity for us. And the funny thing is that we somehow submitted projects under this name, and the funny thing is that we managed to win some of them. And so at some point we had also had a problem to find a way to justify this identity as a real identity, and that was the funny part. But so let's say we had fun, but there also was a way to participate in competition with a very particular way of approaching work. So, for example, our mantra, we self-assign a set of rules. For example, never spend, a big amount of time on a project. Like, we force ourselves to work very little, and I'm spawning a little bit. Another rule was to always use the same project, revise the same project to make entries to the competition. This project was the Sarrocco project by Aldo Rossi, and so we reassembled that project many times, and the first time we did it, we somehow got a special mention. I think it was a competition in Bahrain organized by Domus magazine, and so we simply reassembled the form of Sarrocco. So already done project, we simply reassembled it in a new arrangement, and so the ambition was always to use the same forms for all the competitions. So somehow to reduce as much as possible the amount of work, but at the same time, liberate the project and the forms of this project in other possible lives throughout. So the life of forms, if you want. So that was fantastic. I think it was one of the most, I think, if you want, satisfying and also happy and funny moment in my career. And at the same time, also we had the chance to teach together. And the Berlage, as I mentioned, the Berlage had to relocate from Rotterdam to Delft. But there was one class, the Berlage, was 2 years, and so there was the, let's say, the last generation of the Berlage, a group of students which was left, let's say, were basically the leftovers, if you want, of the old institution, and at the same time there was a new generation starting in Delft already. So that generation was somehow, the heritage of the old institution. So we decided, we attempted and we asked if we could teach to that last generation, and so we managed to do the last studio of the Berlage Institute, basically. And we were lucky enough to bring these students to Iran in a moment where was a very, particular moment after Ahmadinejad, was in power. So troubled political moment, and in fact we had also many troubles in bringing students there, but in the end we managed to do that. We had a very, small group of students, super extremely talented students, and we did this studio in Tehran, which was fantastic, super intense studio, but also what I remember was that we were basically every day there. There was not a studio day because all the week was about the studio. So we almost, there were no official studio days. Like we really totally merged our daily routine. So basically we were going to Delft anyway for writing to the library, right, to work on our thesis dissertation, and every day in the afternoon we are having reviews or conversation with our students. So it was a daily process, and I have to say that was one of the most satisfying teaching experience I had. And then of course with Ahmed and Amir, we invited several people for seminar and classes, and then this work actually became a project, a book project, and which was published years afterwards. But the funny story is that after that studio, somehow, because of certain kinds of movements within TU Delft, basically, the Berlage definitely moved to Delft. We couldn't teach anymore at the Berlage. They didn't hire us afterwards. And so each of us was somehow on our own. I mean, we were still teaching at Delft, but very much part-time. Actually, with a very, and there, again, my research came back again, but with a very weird way of hiring people, which is called 0-hour contract. Basically, your contract is almost like a SIM card. They load you hours as soon as they need hours. So it's a very mean way of hiring people. And that was actually the moment in which we realized that maybe it was the time also to find perspectives abroad or somewhere else. But anyway, in the meantime, we finalized our project. In 2014 we all discussed our dissertation. I was the first of the group to discuss, and then the same year in 2014, also with Ahmed and Amir, we were part of the Biennale, the Elements Biennale of Rem Koolhaas. We were part of the Mondo Italia Pavilion, and we did. At the time, I was very much interested in logistics, and I convinced Amir and Ahmed to work on that. And we did a pavilion on the Piacenza logistical centers of Amazon, but also other companies. It was one of the biggest hubs in Italy, basically entirely related to logistics. And at the time, Mondo Italia was this long exhibition organized by OMA, but dealing only with Italy. So it was almost like a scan of Italy, the state of the art in Italy, a way to map Italy, the conditions of Italy, the situation in Italy at that time, in 2014. And we thought that nobody was talking about the strikes and the riots happening in Piacenza against those companies which were not allowing any unionization within their companies. And so since I was actually, my thesis was precisely about that. I mean, I just discussed a thesis about industrial architecture and labor struggle. I thought that was another, also for me, it was another case study for my future research. And so I think Piacenza was fantastic. And so we did a pavilion about that. And then also that was another project that could have, was meant to be somehow end up in a sort of book. But yes, at the time there were not the funds. And so the book never saw the light. I mean, it was never finalized. I'm not sure if I like the word origin. I don't think there's never really a beginning. I think it's something like constantly, and it's a constant negotiation. I mean, we are like living beings which are constantly negotiate with our interests, context, interests, books we read, movies we see, the situation, the context where we live. So yes, so I had to say that I was being attracted. I've always been attracted by architecture. I've been living in Rome, and since I was a kid, like I've been always interested in space mostly. Like I was always interested in the gigantic and magnificent space of Imperial Rome, right? And so already when I was visiting those ruins, when my parents brought me there at the Fora, or even simply in the countryside, like I was always like, totally fascinated by that. But I think my first mentor was, I think I already mentioned, is Maniere Elia. Like his first history and theory class was just revealing. It was a survey class. I mean, it was an introduction to architecture. So it was not at all a very detailed history class. It was about themes, or very, it was almost like flying through different epochs and buildings, but in such an interesting and with incredible connection between buildings and spatial conceptions and spatial relationship that made this gigantic journey a fantastic adventure. And interestingly enough, now in Chicago, I'm actually responsible for the same class. I'm teaching the introduction of history and theory. So it's fantastic that after so many years, I ended up with the same huge responsibility. And of course, I'm not as good as Maria Elia, but I feel the burden and at the same time the pleasure and the fantastic responsibility to have the same class, to teach the same class somehow. And the other mentor, the many mentors. I was mentioning like in Rome, I love the relationship between architecture and archaeology, and so at that in Roma 3 there is still teaching Luigi Francesini, who is an architect there, and I had him in a second year studio, and he is the one that somehow instilled in me the passion for Etruscan architecture, and so underground architecture, relation with the ground and with the datum of the ground and the excavation itself, and the use of the materials in a particular way, that especially tufa limestone and tufa. And it's interesting that in my graduation project in Delft, I would do all my underground project because of that. Somehow after Roma 3 and then Delft, I went back to my original mentor in Roma 3. But yes, I was very fond. I mean, for me, it was one of my best professors in Roma 3, and I learned so much from him, and especially in my way of designing and also drawing, like the way of drawing. Very, if you want, at that time, still phenomenological. I told you that I did all my hands, so I was still fascinated by this way of conveying information in architecture related to the sign, a specific attention to the sign and the language. And so I was not in love with sketches. I sketch a lot, but I was not those people just conveying ideas with sketches. But I said I love precise drawings, but done in a totally analogical way. So so he told me to draw. If I have something, if I really had to declare my my depth to Luigi Francesini, it really taught me entirely to draw. So Maniere Elia and Roberto Cangiani at the end in my last class were the professor that totally influenced me in the way of theoretically thinking about architecture. And then the person that really taught me how to design was basically Luigi Francesini, and then the dean of the school, Francesco Cellini, who with Franco Purini were basically somehow the leaders of a specific Roman school of architecture that I don't know now at the time to explain. Then when I went to Delft was a very strange environment. There were a lot of voices that influenced me. Of course, my main professor was Mark Skonderbeck, that now is the leader of the territory department. At that time was border condition, and he was the one that was through which I got I was a very somehow like a strong attention to the relationship between architecture and politics. But then obviously, as soon as I met Pier Vittorio, he was the one that somehow he was talking about specific theme at a specific time where I was looking for, you know, for precisely somebody like giving more, you know, theoretical background to those themes, and that person was precisely Pier Vittorio. So although again I met him very briefly at UDELFT, he was teaching also the Berlage Institute at that time. I was somehow following his writings, reading his books, and so when he opened the PhD school, obviously became my a big inspiration. But obviously, you know, then there are other people external which are not, you know, entirely into the architectural world. But yes, if I had to resume my, you know, mentors, those were the people that have been influenced the most. Of course, then there were references. So as I mentioned, I you know, like I came, I was in love originally when I was studying originally at the beginning architecture with specific kind of architecture dealing with, you know, like Alvaro Siza was one of, you know, my favorite architects. But then after, you know, the more I grew up, the more I began to also shift my references, obviously. And then working at OMA, obviously, OMA became almost the gospel, right? And you know, working them, for them, with them was fantastic. Also, I had the chance to work with Rem, so it was like, you know, the way Rem talked about architecture was extremely revolutionary. And funny enough, Rem and Pier Vittorio were antithetical. You know, there was also some clashes between the two, especially at the Berlage Institute. There were a series of articles which were, you know, somehow, you know, criticized each other. And then, oh yes, I mean, when I applied to Chicago, I ended up in Chicago because I was, let's say, honored to win a fellowship here at the USC School of Architecture. But I have to say, I was already attracted by the USC School of Architecture. First of all, because I was aware that I always studied in very small institution. Roma Tre was a very small school. The Berlage Institute was a very small school. USC is a very small school. The only, of course, exception was UDELFT, which is a sort of city. But somehow, like USC felt like the school where I wanted really to go. Was a public school teaching to, you know, so a public institution teaching, you know, like for, you know, lower fee to specific kind of students. And in Chicago, which was a city, I was always attracted because for my PhD, the first chapter of my thesis is about the factories of Albert Kahn. So I went to Detroit several times, and I always managed to travel to Chicago. So it was a city that I was also, you know, constantly attracted to, and I always wanted to live for a while here. So, but you know, the other reason is that IUC was teaching Bob Somol, and Bob Somol was the way of writing and the theoretical, you know, text of Bob Somol always interested me as well. Already when I was in Rotterdam, although at the time Bob Somol went to the Berlage Institute several times, also with Penelope Dean. Penelope Dean studied at Berlage Institute, so they've been teaching there and doing seminars and lecturing there. So I had the chance to, you know, like reading his work there, and so I had to say it was, you know, although abroad and totally opposite to what was at that time happening at the Berlage Institute. I was also attracted by the other side. So somehow, if you want, I'm always, like, I always try to go to the liminal edge of the debate because I always wanted to have the opposite voice, right? So when a voice become, if you want, mainstream, or when I feel that a voice is, you know, now, you know, like somehow like you know, too popular or let's say, yes. Too obvious, then I began to look for exceptions to that voice. And so, yes, I don't know, like, those were my, you know, but of course there are many other names. And for example, as I mentioned, you know, like Roberto Gargiani for me was a fantastic person, then like an incredible teacher. Like I learned from him, I believe, perhaps more than when I was doing my PhD. A way of teaching, like the enthusiasm that Roberto Gargiani expressed in his class is just the same that I try to, you know, infer, like let's say, communicate to my students as well. So I always try to be passionate, committed to not only my studio classes but also my theory classes. And the origin, so I demonstrate you that I don't think there is an origin. I mean, I think I was driven to architecture by my father. My father is an architect, but my father was actually, yes, he was an architect, but also was working for a big company. He was working for the Ministry of Telecommunications. So he was an architect, designing specific buildings, which was actually super interesting. But he had, if you want, a much more constructive and technical approach to architecture. Instead, I'm much more on the conceptual theoretical part, and that's why I also love OMA in the end in my career, because OMA was more about designing the building and conceptually imagining the building rather than realizing it. So Dogma, right? Dogma was famous and is still famous for their conjectures about architecture, although of course now they're also building and finally also realizing their own work. But I was totally in love with Dogma because for me the discussion about the project was even more important. The intention of the project were far more important than the realization of the project itself. I mean, I know that maybe some people are totally against that, but the interesting part is always been attracted by projects that are not being built. Sometimes projects that where the ambition is far superior, even in competition. Like I don't know, the Chausier, for example, the Chausier Library or the Très National Bibliothèque de France, right? I think the OMA project is far more superior than the one eventually built in Paris. And so I don't know, what I'm trying to say is that, and I think it's also what I'm trying to communicate to my students. Like, of course, especially in the US, there is really a willingness, and I think every architect wants to build. But I feel that the project, especially today, when building is more crucial, and perhaps we should not build too much anymore in a planet that is totally ruined and polluted by our interventions and huge impact. I believe that maybe the political capacities of the project to influence the management of the city or the control of the city is far more superior than the building itself. But I'm trying to say the idea of the project or the project itself might be even more interesting or revolutionary than building or leaving our stones like somewhere on the planet. In other words, trying to communicate different ways of dwelling or different policies, trying to implement the way of living or sharing or treating or using resources even way before building. I think it's much more crucial today in a moment where we really have to reevaluate the idea of refurbishing, re-inhabiting, rather than building from scratch, or maybe the idea of destruction, demolition. I think is far more interesting today than the idea of perhaps of construction from scratch. Of course, education to me it's really it's fundamental. Like that's why that is the reason why I love to teach, and I try to embrace the idea of teaching fully. Like architecture school now are changing a lot, and this will require maybe an entire whole discussion. But of course, in architecture school there are people that teach next to their own practice. But I don't know. Sometimes I think education needs really full commitment. Almost that to say that almost that you're not able to do anything else if you really want to commit into that. I don't know, maybe I sound maybe too absolute in this, but I feel that education is extremely important because it is where we forge or we debate the architecture to come, or the ideas of architecture to come, and architecture is a discipline that is drastically changing, and it will change in the decades to come heavily because of the condition in which we are, the climatic and the environmental situation in which we are. Even the building itself, the practice of building will drastically change. And so I don't know, I think education and knowledge, the knowledge production and the, writing, doing research, making exhibitions, discussion. I think those are all activities that are extremely important, if not even more important. That again, adding the next jewel on the, on the earth. I think we are entering in a moment where understanding what we want to be and how we want to live next, it's way more important than simply following some simple profit necessities. Necessities dictated by profit or real estate speculation. So as I said, my PhD was about the architecture of labor and the space of production. So when I arrived in Chicago, I wanted basically to use Chicago as I never published my thesis, but it's something I like to do. And of course, Chicago has always been a case study. The history of Chicago is entirely, tied to the history of labor and labor unionization and struggle. And so it is a history built by migrant labor force, by heavy industry, steel industry, lumber industry, meat industry. The first assembly line was basically born around here. So I thought that it was the best city to be. There's another reason why I'm happy, so happy to be here and be honored to teach here. And so my classes here are somehow are of two kinds, actually three kinds. So on one hand, I teach studios, like architectural design studios at both graduate and undergrad level. But all my studios deal with modes of production, like with somehow with the past of the city of Chicago, somehow teaching the students that although the history of Chicago is pretty recent, it's a city established in the end of the middle of 19th century. Yet in the city there are so many stratifications and so many layers to be unraveled and studied. And also so much architecture that is not usually considered, like all factories or manufacturing buildings around Chicago have never been somehow seriously considered. So Chicago is famous for the Chicago School of Architecture, but never for its factories or stockyards or company towns. And so I think there's an incredible landscape of opportunities and research in the cities, and I try to teach this to my students and look and explore with my students those locations also that are never somehow considered within the Chicago usual architectural tours. And then so these are the studios, and then of course in the seminars I do since I landed in the US, I've been attracted by formal studies. Formal studies in Europe are always been associated with very deep theoretical and political implications, whereas here in the US there's always been a certain, I wouldn't call obviously superficiality, but much more, if you want, detachment or estrangement from ideological problems. So the problems of form were, almost considered in a sort of autonomous field. And since I landed in Chicago, so I found, now that I'm on this side of the Atlantic, I found myself much more interested in this discussion. For example, all the Texas Ranger, environment, for example, right? For example, John Eduk, his Texas houses, and his work. It's one of my references here, and also, also my writings. But somehow some theoretical seminars that I teach, especially at graduate level, deal with themes, sometimes formal themes, sometimes environmental themes. For example, I'm now running a research on the American desert, and it's going to be the second year, and hopefully will end up in a publication, and also on, as I mentioned before, the the industrial past, neglected past of the city. And sorry, I mentioned that. Yes, then there is a third level of education in which I'm involved. Sometimes I teach to undergraduate studios, and now for several years I've been in charge of this studio, which was called the Monastery Studio, which also ended up at the Lisbon Architecture Triennale. Of course, I was not teaching, I was by myself, I was co-teaching with other colleagues of mine, Agata Simienov, who was also teaching at IIT, and Jimmy Carter and Abigail Chang. And now, I mean, we finished this, but we have been teaching this for 3 years, and that was interesting because we were trying to look at the domestic environment and aestheticism as a way to reflect on space and the way production and reproduction occur into space, certain specific activities, and also the way the body behaves in space. And interesting enough, this studio, especially the last year, the studio, somehow coincided with the forced isolation and safety measures of the pandemic. And even the pavilion that we built in Lisbon was in 2019, while basically the pandemic kicked off in Wuhan. So, I mean, there is a strange, let's say, coincidence between this project and the studio, and hopefully this project will also end. Hopefully, I don't know. We are trying to publish the research done in those years with students here. And now instead, I started another project about architecture schools, and because again, I was saying that education is not simply a keyword, but also is a battlefield. Education is changing. The way we teach history, the way we teach studios, especially in the US, is changing. I believe that in the US it's easier to challenge and criticize education because the educational programs are far more recent than in Europe, and somehow the attachment to the tradition is less consolidated. And so here, to criticize entirely the curriculum is almost easier to be done. And so, for example, I don't know, but the relevance of history. For example, teaching history. I teach history in theory. So teaching history today in the U.S. is a very difficult topic and subject. You have to there are struggles to make it more equal and expand beyond the Western the Western canons and the European centric knowledge. And I think all this discussion is super necessary and also interesting to be to be faced. Something I believe in Europe is still not happening enough, especially in big schools where the usual traditional Western trajectory is still the usual traditional curriculum, if you want. So yes, those are some of the three. But yes. I'm currently on yes, I've been here for 4 years, and I have to say I love to constantly also change my studios. I never repeat. I mean, beside the monastery, actually, I always try to challenge myself and never repeat a class. So beside my small big history and theory class, which is a very large class to the second year undergrad, and my other undergrad class, which is the studio, I have to say all the rest, especially for with graduate students, which are, let's say, the older ones, and I try to expose myself and them and my students to every time different topics. So the routine now is odd because of the of the pandemic. But as I mentioned before, I love to be at school. So although I'm full time here, but of course I don't teach every day, but I kept my same rhythm that I had at TU Delft and the Berlage, so I come basically every day at school because my office is at school. I love to be here. I love to be among students. Of course, now obviously with the pandemic it was really hard, I have to say, and so during the pandemic I had to find another space. But yeah, I had to say I really miss school. I'm happy that we're back in person, although with limitations. But yes, I work among students. I even I was famous here at school because I was always sitting among my students. When I was teaching graduate, I had that part of my I mean, graduate students here work with large tables, so they all work together. And I had my spot on the same table, so somehow I kept a place among my students. So again, same thing, same relationship that I had with my Berlage Institute students. Through years, I began to develop this. I believe that this is the good spirit. Like I always try. Yeah, maybe I can say this. I always try to elicit and encourage cooperation. I'm forcing all my studios. At least a part of the studio is always in group or collective, and we even forced the third year undergrad studio that usually is individual to be developed in pairs. So somehow to force students to rely on somebody else, or to have a debate, or even to argue with somebody, and to co-work with somebody, to collaborate with somebody. Precisely because I believe that, especially in the US, but not only in the US, also in other schools, like I don't know, AA in London, individualism is really much cultivated at school. Like you learn at school how to compete, right? To be competitive, to express your capacities within and against also your team, which sometimes agonism and competition is obviously important, especially in this environment. But I also believe that, I think cooperation is much harder, technique and art and, a routine to teach, to let people, to have a discussion and negotiate with, each other necessities and demands and interests. I think is far more satisfying in the end, but also far harder to establish. To establish a spirit in a team is way more difficult than simply let people working on their own and have individual desk. So this is another mission that I've been trying to do here, and I think the best I had with my graduate students, and I think the culminating project that I had was, for example, we always have a collective final outcome in the studio. And I think one of the best here we had, this was right before the pandemic. I ran a studio in the Chicago industry, and we ended up the studio with a mural. So basically redrawing Diego Rivera mural in Detroit, but using Chicago as a case study. So basically we copied Diego Rivera mural, but implementing in that the elements and the past of Chicago. And that was really physically, mentally, conceptually a collective, if you want, work of art, if you want, and I have to say it was one of the most maybe rewarding experiences so far I had at school. Like also with a team of students, was fantastic. So so cooperation, and this is the reason why I think the school is something we should really keep it, have care of it. We might lose it because of Zoom, or we might have lost it because of Zoom. But we need to stick on it, because the studio. I hate the word studio culture, but the studio environment, I think it's something that it's so important, almost sacred to architecture school, and something that is you cannot find anywhere else. And I think again, it's not simply a way of teaching, but also a way of living. The studio life is a way of experimenting what you are doing in your project, sharing, cooking together, eating together. Of course, now it's even more impossible, but having responsibility of cleaning it, presenting, arranging material, arranging expenses. Deciding what to do. So all these things are also designed and lived practically in the studio. And I think I hope it doesn't get lost. So the last Biennale was called How We Live Together. I think the studio is paradoxically one of the most interesting experiments, and maybe it's not discussed enough. I have to say it's hard, this question, especially after the pandemic, because the pandemic changed totally the way of approaching things. I don't know, I was shocked. Also, I lived the pandemic in the US in a moment where which was shocked by riots, manifestation, protests, I remember the lockdown was very hard, and the first time we went out of the lockdown was for the protest for George Floyd, and I don't know. And during these days, I felt the architectural debate was totally far away from those discussions, far away from those problems, far away from those issues. And suddenly, then the pandemic hit, and all the architects began to talk about the internal, the domestic environment, Roomba cleaners like Hoovers. I don't know, trajectories. I don't know. It's almost if to say that architecture are always good in capitalizing discussions, but I'm not sure until when architecture is able to, I don't know, seriously intervene or practically intervene with some effects to the world rather than simply talk about it. And so I don't know. I from the pandemic, I've been trying to learn how to be like silent and observe more and learn more and observe more and be more less judgmental and more careful in what to say and what to express rather than simply trying to follow the next wave of debates or topics on Instagram or curatorial topics. It's very easy to curate things. It's much more difficult to profess them and have a serious impact over the city. So I wish to learn more and to be more respectful to other perspectives. Like for example, teaching is not easy precisely in this moment where where all the criteria and principle on which that we use for teaching so far are crumbling. And I think that's why it's way more challenging to learn to teach now and teaching now, because all the categories have been gradually eroded and subverted and retooled. And so I think it's an exciting time to totally rediscuss the criteria upon which we teach. And so I hope to learn to be more sensitive and sensible and respectful in the way I do my job. And I don't think this is so banal, because I still feel that architects don't simply not care, but as I was mentioning before this meeting, it seems that I think the pandemic I was hoping to have more silence and more respect from the architectural debate onwards. Instead it feels that everything will kept on going right as soon as if nothing happened. Again, with the what happened this summer, with all the environmental disasters happening all over Europe, the US, high temperature, rain disaster, so I don't know. I think yes, I will invite the entire architectural community to just look around themselves and see where we are. But from the past, what was difficult in the past? I had to say, I think the biggest problem for me, and it's always this, you also teaching, you learn and you are committed to certain topics in school, and you're trying to propose ideas or conjecture ideas, also to change, to conjecture ideas to not change the system, but to propose other systems, right? That could be implemented, right? But then often the project gets corrupted or gets hampered by other decisions that are beyond the architectural decisions. And this is precisely when architecture also becomes really political. That's why I'm saying that sometimes projects are way more important than the material outcome, because I think the architectural project should be implemented through bureaucracy, through techniques and political activity. And that's why in the recent years I also become more and more interested in what happens beyond, for example, to establish certain measure at the level of the city, at the urban scale, So how you can implement really what you are, what you're putting on the paper, and how you can make it happen in a city, rather than simply, not to say again that to do a building is less important, but I believe that the laws that allow building to rise are way more important than the buildings themselves, and to establish a sets of criteria for buildings to, and in a sustainable and more, if you want, more balanced way. I think it's way more urgent and more necessary than simply conjecture new ideas for buildings. And so so in the past it was very hard to understand those. I remember when I was a student, it was very frustrating to see, but also while working, right, is to see a project leaving the office and getting realized with so many difficulties and so many shifts and clients manipulations and city manipulations and regulation manipulations, that somehow the idea had to be compromised. From those early frustration to instead much more bigger frustration, which is the way the city is really built and used. Those gaps for me were the most difficult part to understand, and still today I'm struggling to do that. So I think it's a constant challenge.